We are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these conversations, guests get to share their successes and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome specific obstacles along their journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally, and today I am delighted to be joined by Deidre. Deidre Guy, thank you so much for coming to the conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always a great conversation about accessibility. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time, so I'm happy to share anything that people are willing to listen to.
Well, I have a lot that I'm sure everyone today wants to hear about your journey, your expertise in the accessibility space. So to help us, give us an overview of your experience in the accessibility world. How did you get into the space and become a leader?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I don't think anyone's ever really asked me this question exactly like this before. And I think I've always been somebody who just can't handle what I deem to be injustice. So even as a small child, when people were ostracizing someone, I was always the one that would go over and say, come on, you can come and play with me, come to my house, that kind of a thing. And I developed a disability myself. I have a couple of invisible disabilities. People see me, they don't often think of me as being disabled because I'm old and have developed some pretty good coping mechanisms at this point. But, as a teenager, I suffered and went through a significant amount of trauma for quite a few years at the hand of a family member, which resulted in me living with and doing my best to manage PTSD. So it took a long time for me to really recognize that is a disability. I also live with what I guess is categorized as an environmental disability, which means that I'm severely, I don't even know if allergic is the right word, but I have big problems with fragrance. I can become quite ill with things that have a smell. Even stuff that says it's unscented, I still find scented. And so even today, if I go out somewhere, if I'm going to a meeting or an event, and I wind up in a situation where something is creating a strong smell, uh, it can and often does result in me turning around and going home. So there's still that kind of injustice, where it's like, oh, I was just heading out on my day and now this has happened. And it's no real fault of anyone in particular, but it's a collective issue that needs people to work with it. And I see accessibility as that kind of a thing where there's a lot of unfairness, a lot of injustice. I don't see it as any one particular person's fault, but it's going to take a big village of us to try and help folks understand the areas of concern and actually get rid of all the stigma and the myths and understand the reality of accessibility in the disability community, and how you can be involved and how it doesn't cost a fortune and how much of it makes sense for folks who don't identify as disabled. So as you can tell, I can rant on this for a while, but
Yeah,
that's kind of, and so I saw something that was not fair in my mind, and I was at an event. It was actually an accessibility event in a university here in Toronto, and I saw something where a woman who already walked with a cane had decided that she was going to attempt to go get a coffee and not use her cane at that point. So when she came past my table, back with her coffee, she lost her balance and spilled her coffee and fell right in front of me. I was seated. She was standing and, of course, fell on the floor in front of me. And it resulted in about 30 people coming by to say, oh my goodness, what can we do? And I thought, my gosh, I don't know what to do. I don't know physically what to do to help her get up. But I know that all these people in her face aren't helping and we need a better education. So I started after that working in the accessibility consulting space, mostly in the built environment. But that led me to understanding that I had the ability to make a difference for people when it came to accessibility.
I love it. Making a difference is going to help accessibility, certainly in a positive way. So I appreciate the empathy and personal experiences that drove your self passion. You talk about some of the injustices and that it's unfair. Can you maybe highlight or dive into a couple of those injustices and and the lack of equality that you see persisting now?
Well, something that I've experienced most of my life and still see it as a problem is the inability for organizations, although it's happening less so, but just everyday people to recognize those invisible disabilities and how difficult they can be for people to live. I have so many people in my life who deal with mental health, who disabilities, who have PTSD, ADHD, whatever you want to call it. They all, I mean, they all are, for the most part, invisible. I mean, you see it in people's behaviors and responses, but if you meet that person on the street and they've got their coping skills happening, then you won't necessarily know that. So when they're experiencing and their coping skills aren't there for them, and
Yeah.
the disability is head on, people have not got the knowledge and understanding to be able to deal with the circumstance from a level of empathy and patience. And so that looks like me not being able to share with my bosses for many, many years that I couldn't come into work today because I couldn't function. Because of what was going on in my mind, as opposed to saying I've got the flu, I broke a leg, whatever. Breaking a leg's a bit heavy, like you got to follow up with that one. So I usually went with the flu. But for me that was always unfair and not genuine, and really led to a bit of an imposter syndrome. So I still see that happening today. I see large organizations globally talking about mental health and talking about supporting it. But when you look at their sort of grassroots employees at those base level, retail outlets, whatever the example might be, are they still able to call in sick because they have depression, because their anxiety, or do they still suffer that stigma? So for me, I still see that as something that's ongoing and has been an experience of mine for my whole life.
Mm. I, I think you had indicated something around the identification of it being a disability, and maybe the lightening of how that's framed. I just had a conversation with a leader at one of the um, top universities here in the States, and she was indicating it was so interesting. This podcast will come out as well. It was so interesting where as the resources that are being provided to students are more generally available. There's not as you don't have to go and fill out paperwork and have a doctor confirm that this is a documented disability. It may be someone may have dyslexia or may have ADHD and it's not medically diagnosed. The point is, in short, is that the adoption of the assistive technologies, what's known as assistive technologies to the university, because the barrier of entry and the ease of just getting the access to an assistive technology without having to do such personal identification, the rise of the use of these assistive technologies is through the roof.
Mm.
And so when you talk about this invisible disability and those that are visible, the stigmatism, right? Like there's a stigmatism of the person who has to go through this effort of getting the assistive technologies, and then hopefully the conversations like this are raising the awareness of the invisible and visible disabilities of how someone needs to empathize with you or anyone else.
Well, and it's tough because empathy for folks with visible disabilities is still pretty slim, right? So when you start to ask folks to be empathetic towards those of us with invisible disabilities, those who don't necessarily feel that they fit in either category are like, oh my God, like, what do I do? It would be, and this is something that I learned and am passionate about when it comes to built environment accessibility. First of all, there are ways that you can contribute positively to invisible disabilities within the built environment. Color, sound, texture, uh, privacy, security, all those kinds of things can really help support invisible disabilities at the same time as you're creating wide enough doorways and large enough accessible stalls. And what happens in Canada in a lot of places, and I think that this is a global issue, is that we are like, okay, this is our code. This is what we have to do in order to meet the building code, have our building passed, get it transferred over to the people that are actually going to be utilizing the building. And then those folks are like, okay, well, it meets code, so it's accessible. And in the meantime, nobody has taken that step back to say, okay, what about the people who are actually using this building? And what are they going to get? Like your building is not accessible. And if it's meeting code, when you first have it the plans and built all that kind of stuff. Your first trip to the architectural firm, by the time you get into that building, depending on the size of it, code is iterated again. And so now you've got a whole new thing that you've got to follow with, where if you were just planning for the end user, putting accessibility in at the beginning, and I see you jumping to say something, but start it from the beginning, and including education about invisible and visible disabilities.
Yeah, I mean, the jump for excitement is you're talking about the experience, right? You're talking about
Yeah.
something that is an area that I'm very passionate about, which is okay, in the built environment, you have a certain standard of building code, and in the digital space, the YCAG standard is oftentimes, I think there's a misconception on meeting the standard, meeting the code, and saying, how many websites do you see? It's like, we are YCAG 2.1 compliant. Well, I can meet the building code and I can meet the YCAG code, but I don't necessarily have to deliver a universal positive experience to the user, right? They're the two together aren't synonymous. So yeah, I mean, I mean, the built accessibility world is a whole different beast than the digital. There's, hopefully there's overlap on the strategic thinking when you need to accommodate both of those, but you hit the nail
That
on
would
the
be
head,
nice.
and yeah,
Yeah.
perks my ears up.
Yes, for sure. And there's simple things too, like we spoke about, when it comes to, from a technology perspective. And it's not just how you're delivering, but it's what you're delivering. Is that accessible? Are your words, is your language plain? Like, is your communication something that people are going to maintain interest in? Even just spacing of the letters and fonts and things like that. Those are all really important when it comes to, so many of us are dealing with what could be labeled as a disability if they took the time to really explore it. And so they don't need to, we don't have to do that. But if we as a society are building things, creating things so that they include all of these, what we call outlying, types of disabilities. And it's not even outlying. I think it's all intermingled with all of us. We're maybe folks that are dyslexic that don't really recognize it. They just shy away from reading because they can't really do it. So they just don't, and they haven't had to. But if something's in front of them that's accessible for folks with dyslexia, and then they can be like, oh, it can open their lives, can open up their lives. So, and this is where, that stigma thing is really huge. And I think it's one of our biggest battles, is because once we lose the stigma, we'll be more ready to put our money where our mouth is. And that's really, really necessary.
So, from a professional setting and some of the engagements you've gone through, your experience working with um, your partners, where are the challenges of implementing and scaling and the accessibility strategies that you've come across?
Well, again, people are adding it on as a band-aid, and that never works. People discover, halfway through a process that they've forgotten the disability community in all of their conversations, or they have one person with a disability and they think they've got it all covered, when in reality, we know that there are myriad disabilities, and not that you need to have a person representing each type of disability, because that, would be endless. But certainly there are ways to connect with organizations that support disability in general. The disability community, at least in Canada, in my experience, is starting to become less siloed. So we've always been very siloed. This is the disability that we are fundraising for. This is our passion. And it's because it's coming out of a need from someone who's gone through an experience and recognizes that there needs to be more in the conversation about that particular experience, but it's leaving out other types of disabilities. So there, those silos are being, windows are getting open, doors are getting open, people are talking amongst the disability community. And there are organizations within Canada and globally that you can join that help to sort of try to bring the conversations together. And I think that that's a really big part of it. Unfortunately, our governments, for many years have not necessarily, in my opinion, been paying enough attention to disability and accessibility. So one of the things that we've talked about, you and I, Brian, is a nonprofit that I started a number of years ago that supports disabled owned businesses as well as veteran owned businesses. And we, everyone probably has an inkling that many veterans do end up with a disability. So trying to help those disabled-owned and veteran-owned businesses gain access to large corporations and large purchasing organizations, the supply chain within those organizations. And now those organizations were interested in doing business with these diverse owned companies and many others, but trying to figure out how does that work? How do you get these small businesses into your big animal of a supply chain? And so, this is where I think our governments can step in. In my particular province, we had the beginnings of fantastic legislation, and it was evolving and people were paying attention, and it's sort of been moved away as maybe a bit too much red tape right now, and so people are not necessarily following it. Unfortunately, as a society, we need to be legislated into doing so many things. I mean, how
Yeah.
many of us did not wear seatbelts until we had to? And so this is in that category. So people are not seeing it as something that we have to have in our society in order to be fair and equal and equitable for everyone. They're seeing it as something they have to do because the government is telling them to. And realistically, how many of us are going to get out of this life without a disability? Not many, right? Most of us are going to wind up with a disability before we leave this life. So, and until it becomes personal, people just don't pay enough attention. So there's so many barriers, but again, and I always say, but I should say, and there's so many barriers, and we're working on them, and they're coming down, and more people are learning. And podcasts like what you do is making a difference.
Yeah, I mean, you said more conversations happening, which more conversation happening and in the right way is a very good motion.
Mm-hmm.
When you first launched your organization, what was the aha moment between the brands and these big conglomerates and the businesses that you were helping to connect? I'm curious, like, was it like, oh, we just never knew they existed, or what was the the aha moment, like I was saying?
So the supplier council that I started was one of 5 others. I guess there were 5 others at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, the feedback I got was, oh, another one, right? And how can people with disabilities run a business? And how can veterans run a business? That was a big thing I got. I had someone
Mm.
say to me, not knowing that I live with PTSD, how can someone with PTSD even run a business? And so, do you know anyone with PTSD who runs a business? And so I put my hand up, and she was like, oh my goodness. So then she had tons of questions, and of course, she lost a lot of stigma that day, right? Which is wonderful. She was unlearning, which I love that word. So I think the thing I heard, so we would create virtual matchmaking sessions. We called them MM5s, or match made in 5 minutes. So we would have one corporate purchasing entity, which could be government as well, so large purchasing organization, and we coerce them into having a number of people coming from procurement, ideally buyers, that so that the conversations could be very direct, and we would have 15 disabled or veteran-owned businesses on the other side of the conversation. We'd do a quick introduction, and then we'd step back and we'd just time them, and they would each get a period of time, which is usually 5 to 10 minutes, to pitch their business directly to these purchasing organizations.
It's
Every
amazing.
single one of them came back to me after the fact and was absolutely amazed at these businesses and innovative and all, they had all the words. How relevant they were was one great word that I loved. But that was a big surprise for them. And so, and it's a huge eye opening for a lot of people to understand how someone with a disability could be doing this, that, or whatever. Insert activity here, right? So, and I think on the end of the suppliers, the small business owners, disabled or veteran-owned businesses, one of the things that I heard back from them that they really enjoyed about that experience is that the people they were pitching to already knew they had a disability, or there was a good likely that they were going to a possibility that
Yeah.
someone was going to be there with a disability. So they removed what was referred to often as the face, right? So I've had someone who runs a business very successfully that I know that worked with has cerebral palsy. So he often has other people communicate on his behalf, and he prefers to communicate non-verbally. And there often comes a point where he has to meet his client face to face. And many times they're not even a client yet. It's still the sales process. And so he will go wheeling into the office, and immediately they get the face, which is, oh gosh, okay, I didn't know. Now, how do and I think it's a lot of fear. Like, how do I talk to this person who's nonverbal? What do I do? How do I, there's an interpreter here. How do I manage that? It's a lot of fear. So they would come to these networking sessions and then subsequently the in-person ones when they were able to make it and not see that face. And so that was really big for them in the business world because they don't see it. It's something they see all the time in their lives, and in particular in the business world.
I am just thinking about the name of our podcast as Beyond Barriers, and it's you literally did that in from this effort, and it's pretty amazing and humbling to be able to do that. I'll be curious, and if it doesn't, then I'm just saying something that's totally random. But if my cat's meow shows up on our episode because
I
she
don't
is
hear it.
meowing like crazy, she must want some attention. But such as when you, I guess, if I were in a studio in a controlled environment, it might not pop up. But since it isn't, and so where would you say? I guess two things. You talk about like the involvement from government, right? And I think that's the seatbelt was a great example, but you don't want to create too much bureaucracy and too much red tape. Is there examples specifically where you see the intended help actually causing more challenges to the success?
I've seen circumstances where, the accessibility code that's supposed to be followed is contradictory to the local building code. And so those kinds of challenges come up.
That's a good
I
example.
see
Yeah.
where there's interpretations of the code. So some people are in their building, they're being told they have to put tactile warning indicators in this place. And tactile warning indicators are the little bumps that you find on the ground when you're changing elevation. Basically, it's a warning to many people to know that the elevation is going to be changing. And so, but other buildings didn't have to put them in that place, and so they were passing inspections, and the first ones weren't. So that lack of clarity, and I don't know how it is in the States. I know that the States has a pretty fantastic accessibility legislation. Canada is working on a new one, so we are just working on the development of the language and all of the actual minutia of the legislation. So I'm really looking forward to that. A lot of us are. We really feel it's going to be beneficial in so many ways for so many people. But I think and so those are the ways that we see it conflicting. We see people talking just code, accessibility advisors that are consultants or supporters, whatever the accessibility team, thinking that they've got their building fully accessible because it meets code. And I don't know if we can swear on this program, but you can bleep it out. But I had someone say to me a number of years ago, code. No, I'm not building my building to code. That's just the shittiest building you can build legally. And I was like, that's a very good point, and people don't see it that way. So I think, there was a study done by someone that I know here in Canada who took a look at what it would cost to make doors wider from the builder's standpoint. And he was able to show where it actually costs less money to make a wider door consistently through your entire building. So I think that kind of information would be very helpful. Where does it actually benefit the people working on plans, understanding the building, the architecture itself? Where can they say, okay, this is actually going to cost you less in the long run? I mean, you can
Yeah.
see it where if they don't design for it and it has to be added on later, but those costs aren't really necessarily meshed together from the top down perspective. So there's a lot of disconnect between what the top thinks is happening in terms of the building being built and what the folks doing the actual work are doing. So that's a big problem as well. It sounds so simple, and it's absolutely not, but it all does boil down to empathy and education. People understanding why the need. So education, education, education. I explained to people why the need, and then how to fix it. It becomes, we call it the black hole, of accessibility. Like, people don't know what they don't know, and they're afraid to find out. Someone has told them the building is accessible. There's a sign on the door, there's a sticker on the door, so they're good to go. They don't deal with it until someone complains.
Yep. I mean, the same goes back to an accessibility statement on a website. So, what are the biggest disruptions that are coming to accessibility?
Gosh, well, I hope that the new
Legislation being reworked is
legislation is a big disruption. Absolutely. You know, the work that all of the supplier councils are doing in the area of supplier diversity goes above and beyond just, I don't want to say just because it's the main focus, but there's more to it than the networking. There's a lot of advocacy within private industry as well as in governments, large and small. And so the IWSCC, the organization, I'm not with them any longer, but they will still, the team is still very passionate. They will move forward in terms of that level of education even in that community, which needs to be larger. So if you're a diverse owned business, reach out to the supplier councils in Canada and learn about getting certified. But within that community, IWSCC has been able to educate a whole host of people on the need for accessibility and understanding it and how it even relates to them personally. So, a lot of that type of, it's always very grassroots. It's always very, very grassroots. We do have one of our provinces on the West Coast and one on the East Coast. Both have put some new legislation together that really is making great steps and strides. But we also are seeing private industry in Canada really stepping up as well and looking at can they do more? Absolutely. With all the dollars they have, they absolutely can apply more money to it. But the language, the conversation is there, the understanding is there within procurement. And that's the area that I'm more familiar with. So within procurement, people are talking accessibility on how to be accessible within their procurement processes, which is something we did a lot of research on with IWSCC. And so I have a good understanding of the procurement process and the barriers to disabled owned businesses and really small to medium sized businesses in general. So there's focus on that, and then there's focus on purchasing things that are accessible in the first place. So, and then of course within communities, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Often the A, in my opinion, should be added. Accessibility should be added. People think it's included in there, and they think they've got it covered. And my experience is that that's not the case. They need to be also considering accessibility there. But more and more that's happening. And these types of conversations, we've got people with disabilities that are doing more and more things with social media. They're able to put it out everywhere. One of the folks that I work with, Mike Shorman, paddleboarded across all 5 Great Lakes after acquiring a disability in 2018. He did that all in one summer. Can you imagine? With or without a disability, those lakes are big. So yeah, so he actually has a documentary. He's doing a lot of keynote speaking. So he's someone that's, speaking out on what you can do with a disability, but also the mental health that he went through after acquiring a disability. He talks a lot about that as well. So those kind of things, they're little disruptors, but they're popping up everywhere, and soon they're going to be unavoidable.
I love it. Something that I always take away, and it's more of what the audience that's listening and watching takes away than me, but the inspiration and the passion that you've been speaking from um, is moving. One thing I always like to ask when we close out, is there anything that we didn't cover today that you want to make sure we highlight in the conversation around accessibility?
Um, we covered it slightly, but I think I'd really like to focus on it, and that is consider accessibility first and include the disability community in anything you do that talks about accessibility. So however accessibility touches your life, make sure it's first. If you're putting a plan together, include accessibility from the beginning. Big or small, doesn't matter. And secondly, get informed. So speak with the accessibility community to know that what you're doing is actually good for the end user.
Amazing. Well, a very nice, informative conversation. The piece that will definitely be taken away is the visible and invisible aspect to how to be inclusive, right? And so I just want to thank you for spending a half hour sharing your expertise, your own personal experiences, and the great work that you've done to help drive more businesses into the supply chain and into the procurement space that touch on the accessibility community. So, Deidre, thank you. It was a very nice, enjoyable conversation.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thanks for searching me out. I'm always happy to have these conversations. So it's been a month or two since I have, so it's nice to dust it off and bring it out again and
There was
rediscover
no
that.
dust on the conversation. Take care.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in.